I've been fishing since I was a kid. My father taught me when I was about 7 years old, and I never really stopped. It's one of the few hobbies I have that helps me clear my mind. I don't care if I catch anything big. Just being on the water with a rod in my hands is enough. 2 summers ago, I was on a week's vacation from work and decided to spend some of it at a small lake about 40 minutes from my home. It wasn't a famous fishing spot. In fact, I only knew about it because an old coworker mentioned it once. He told me the place was quiet, not crowded, and that it had some surprisingly big bass if you knew where to look. The lake was surrounded by thick trees, with only a few rough paths down to the water. There was no pier, no rental boats, no store, nothing. Just still water and forest. I liked that. It meant I could fish without hearing kids screaming or music blasting from someone's speaker. That morning was clear and warm. The kind of morning where the sun makes the water look like glass. I parked on the dirt pull-off near the road, grabbed my tackle box and rod, and followed the path down through the trees. The air smelled like wet earth and pine needles. Birds were chirping. Everything was calm. When I reached the shore, I noticed there was no one else there. Not a single fisherman. I remember thinking that was strange, because it was perfect fishing weather. Still, I set up near a fallen log that jutted halfway into the water, figuring it would be a good spot to cast. For the first hour, I didn't catch much. Just a couple of small bluegill that I let go immediately. The only sounds were the occasional splash of a fish somewhere across the lake and the soft rustle of wind in the leaves. Around 10 o'clock, I noticed the water had gone almost unnaturally still. Even the breeze seemed to stop. That's when I saw the ripple. It started about 30 feet out, near the center of the lake. At first, I thought it was just a turtle surfacing, but the ripple was too wide, too deliberate. Something large was moving just under the surface, coming in my direction. I froze, my rod still in hand. The shape kept coming slow and steady, but I couldn't see what it was. Then about 15 feet from shore, it stopped completely. The water smoothed over like nothing had been there. I waited, scanning the surface. A minute passed, then another. Just as I began to think it had been my imagination, I felt a sudden tug on my fishing line. Not the kind of sharp pull you get when a fish strikes, but a slow, heavy drag, like something big had taken hold of it and was moving away. My first thought was that I'd hooked a large carp, or maybe a snapping turtle. Whatever it was, it had some weight. I gripped the rod and tried to reel in, but the line didn't tighten. It felt like I was pulling against something that wasn't fighting, just moving steadily deeper into the lake. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the tension vanished. The line went slack. I reeled in quickly, expecting to find the bait gone, but when I pulled it out, the hook was completely straightened out, metal bent like a paper clip. That made no sense. I've had hooks bent before, but it usually takes a massive fish or a bad snag on rocks. This was different. There were no rocks where I was casting, and whatever did that had to be incredibly strong. I sat back, staring at the water, feeling a strange unease. The silence around me felt heavier now. No birds, no breeze, not even the faint hum of insects. Just stillness. I should have left then, but I told myself I was overreacting. I rebaited my hook and cast out again, farther this time, toward the spot where the ripple had started earlier. A few minutes later, it happened again, the slow, heavy pull, as if something was taking the line straight down. I tried to set the hook, but the rod bowed so hard I thought it might snap. My reel screamed as line stripped out fast, and then the water broke. For less than 2 seconds, I saw it, something pale, almost white, rising just under the surface. It wasn't a fish. The shape was too wide, too smooth, and there was a strange pattern on it, like ridges or scars. Before I could make sense of it, it rolled back under, and the line went slack again. I didn't move. I just sat there, breathing hard, staring at the ripples that slowly spread out from where it had been. I realized my hands were shaking. That's when I heard it, a sound from under the water. It was faint, like a low hum or vibration, almost mechanical but uneven. It lasted maybe 3 seconds before fading. I didn't cast again. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could without dropping anything, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. When I finally made it back to the dirt pull-off, my shirt was sticking to my back with sweat, even though the air was still cool. I've been back to a lot of lakes since then, but not that one. And the strangest part? I looked it up later, just out of curiosity. There's no record of fish stocking in that lake for the last 10 years. No record of it even being managed for fishing. Just an isolated body of water with nothing official on paper. I don't know what I hooked that day, but I know I wasn't the only one aware of it, because when I told my old co-worker about what happened, he didn't act surprised. He just nodded and said quietly, "Yeah, that's why I stopped going there." I spent my 20s working on commercial fishing boats off the coast. It's hard work, long days, rough weather, and not much sleep, but it paid better than anything else I could get without a degree. You learn to live with the salt in your hair, the smell of diesel and fish, and the constant rocking under your feet. This happened in 2014, when I was part of a four-man crew on a small trawler out of a harbor in Maine. We mostly went after cod, haddock, and pollock, staying out for 3 or 4 days at a time. I'd been with that crew for almost 2 years by then. On the third night of one trip, we were about 40 miles offshore. The sky was overcast, the sea calm, but there was no moon, just a flat darkness that made the horizon disappear. The only light came from the deck lamps and the dull glow from the wheelhouse windows. We'd been hauling in the net for about an hour. The winch groaned, pulling the heavy load up from the deep. I was standing near the stern, guiding the net as it rose, when I noticed something strange. The net seemed heavier than usual, even for a good haul. The cables were straining, and the winch motor was making a high, uneven whine. When the net finally broke the surface, I saw why. Mixed in with the fish was something massive, not moving, but tangled deep in the mesh. At first, I thought it was a section of old fishing gear, maybe a piece of a wrecked trawler. But as more of it came up, I saw it wasn't metal at all. It looked organic. The surface was pale gray, smooth in some spots and strangely ridged in others. There were no fins, no scales, just long, deep grooves running along its length. Part of it hung limp, heavy with water, and as the net swung over the deck, a dark liquid dripped from it, thicker than seawater, almost like diluted oil. We had to cut some of the mesh to get a better look. That's when the smell hit us. A deep, rotting stench that overpowered the usual fish smell instantly. It was the kind of odor that makes the back of your throat tighten and your stomach lurch. Dave, our skipper, swore under his breath. "That's no fish," he said. Up close, the thing was about 12 feet long, but it was hard to tell where it began or ended. One end tapered into a ragged shape that might have been torn or bitten off. The other end was wide, with thick folds of flesh that looked wrong somehow, like they had been folded or crushed, but not by anything mechanical. The strangest part was the texture. Under the deck lights, it seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. When I touched it, against my better judgment, the skin felt cold and rubbery, almost like wet leather. We debated whether to keep it or cut it loose. Dave said if it was a marine mammal, there might be fines for bringing it in. But none of us could figure out what it was. It wasn't like any whale or dolphin I'd ever seen, alive or dead. While we argued, a sound rose from somewhere out in the darkness, low and deep, carrying over the water. It wasn't the sound of another boat's engine. It was more like a call, a long, resonant moan that seemed to vibrate through the hull. All of us froze. The sound lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. The water around us was still. Dave didn't hesitate after that. "Cut it loose," he ordered. We worked fast, slicing through the net where it tangled around the thing. As the last strand gave way, the weight shifted and the carcass, or whatever it was, slid off the deck into the water with a heavy splash. We stood there, staring at the dark surface. For a few moments, nothing happened. Then, without warning, something large moved just under the water, right where the body had sunk. The deck swayed with a sudden swell, and I swear I saw a massive shadow glide beneath us before disappearing into the depths. No one spoke for the rest of the night. We hauled the rest of the catch in silence, the smell of that thing still clinging to the deck long after it was gone. When we docked 2 days later, Dave didn't log anything unusual in the catch records. He told us to keep our mouths shut about it, said people would just think we were telling stories. But I still think about that sound we heard. I've been out on the water hundreds of times since, in all kinds of weather, but I've never heard anything like it again. Whatever we pulled up that night didn't belong in our nets, and whatever took it back, I'm not sure it belonged in our waters at all. I do a lot of night fishing in the summer. The air is cooler, the water's quieter, and the bigger fish tend to bite after sunset. Most people don't like fishing in the dark. They say it's creepy or dangerous, but I've always enjoyed it. There's something peaceful about being out there when the world is asleep. This happened 3 years ago, on a late August night. I'd driven out to a river about an hour from my place. It's a long, winding river with a slow current and high, grassy banks in most places. There's one particular bend where the water gets deep, and I've pulled in some big catfish there over the years. I got there just before sunset, parked my truck in a small dirt clearing, and carried my gear down to the bank. The sun was low and orange, throwing long shadows across the water. The smell of the river, that mix of mud, algae, and damp plants, hung heavy in the air. By the time I'd set up, the light was fading fast. I cast out 2 lines, propped the rods and holders, and settled into my folding chair. The only sounds were the soft flow of the current and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. Around 10 p.m., the moon was high enough to light the water in a pale silver glow. I'd caught a couple of small channel cats by then and released them. The night was calm. Too calm, now that I think about it. I was halfway through a thermos of coffee when I noticed movement upstream. It was just a shadow at first, a shape standing still near the edge of the water about 50 yards away. My first thought was that another fisherman had shown up, which was unusual for that late at night, but not impossible. I raised my hand and gave a small wave. No reaction. Whoever it was just stood there, half in the moonlight, half in shadow. After a few seconds, I turned back to check my lines. When I glanced upstream again, the figure was gone. I figured they'd moved back into the trees. About 15 minutes later, I heard something, the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel. Not behind me, not in the trees, but along the riverbank itself, getting closer. The sound was slow, deliberate, almost like someone dragging their feet. I stood up, my flashlight in hand, and aimed it up the bank. The beam caught him, a man standing maybe 20 yards away. He was tall and thin, wearing what looked like old, faded overalls and a dark shirt. His face was shadowed by the brim of a cap, but I could see enough to know he wasn't smiling or waving back. He was just looking at me. "Evenin'," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You fishin' too?" He didn't answer, didn't move, just kept staring. Something about the way he stood, perfectly still, head slightly tilted, made the hairs on the back of my neck rise. I was suddenly aware of how far I was from my truck, how quiet it was, and how alone I felt. I decided to break the silence. "Water's deep over there," I said, nodding upstream. "Better bites down this way." Again, nothing. Then slowly, he took a step toward me, and another. His feet made almost no sound now, just the faintest scrape on the dirt. My flashlight beam shook slightly as I kept it on him. He was maybe 15 yards away now, close enough that I could see his eyes under the shadow of the cap. They looked wrong. Too wide, unblinking, reflecting the light like an animal's at night. Something in my gut screamed that this wasn't right. I stepped back toward my rods, already thinking about packing up. That's when he stopped, crouched slightly, like he was about to lunge, and whispered something I couldn't make out. It wasn't loud enough to understand, but it was fast, like muttering or chanting. I didn't wait to hear it again. I yanked my rods from the holders, stuffed them under my arm, grabbed my tackle box, and started backing up toward the path. My eyes never left him. He didn't follow. He just stood there, still crouched, still watching, until I was far enough up the bank that the tall grass hid him from view. When I reached my truck, I threw everything in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I backed out fast, headlights sweeping across the trees, and in that split second, I saw him again, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the light. I didn't stick around to see if he'd move. I floored it out of there, the image of those wide, reflective eyes burned into my mind. I've been back to that river plenty of times since, but I avoid that bend completely. And if I fish at night now, I keep a flashlight in one hand and my truck within sight, because I have no idea who or what that man was. But I know he wasn't just out there to fish.